Get started, welcome to the last and final session. The panel you see before you is all that stands between you and the free wine and beer generously provided by the Political Quarterly. We have a lot to cover, but we will attempt to race through it fairly quickly. I understand that if you scanned that barcode for Slido in the last session, it didn't work. I don't know whether that has been rectified or not, but I can still take questions online on Slido, but for people in the room, you may be better off just raising your hand if you can't get into Slido. We have four excellent panelists, and I think I'll introduce them as we go along. But I'm going to ask each of them to start off with what is a sort of fairly obvious question from the title of the panel, which, given what we know, given everything we've heard, given what the parties have said so far, what are the big issues in terms of migration, and in particular migration policy, likely to be for the next government? And to the extent that panelists feel willing or able to answer them, what are the possible approaches or most sensible approaches that government could take to dealing with them? And I'm going to start with Madeleine Sumption, who, as I think pretty much everyone in this room will know, is director of the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford, as well as a member of the Migration Advisory Committee. Madeleine.
Thanks. Lots of things I could say. I guess sort of useful maybe to break it down into the different categories. We've basically got four main categories of, in terms of the immigration part of the picture. So workers, students, family members, and asylum. And I think, there will be different challenges in each of those areas. I won't talk about all of them. I think, on asylum, the big issue is, this is, I think, where we see the biggest difference between the parties, is what's going to happen, firstly, with the people who are already here, but then, both parties are saying they have a plan to deter people from coming to the UK. It's not immediately obvious that either of those plans is going to be effective. And so where we may be in the next couple of years is dealing with continued people arriving in small boats, and the government sort of facing a real challenge trying to deal with those flows. On work, I think the key. Well, I'm here. I'm afraid to tell panel 2 earlier that the technocratic dream is an illusion, and I'm afraid I'm one of the technocrats, and I don't have the answers. I can't tell you how many hairdressers and engineers and butchers we need in the Northwest or whatever. I think one of the challenges, particularly on work visas, I think that there are sort of unrealistic demands often in the political debate about what we can actually resolve technocratically. So I think there's this idea that there's a certain number of people that we need, and if we can work out how many people we need and who they are, then we just adjust the visa policy, and it's all going to be wonderfully scientific and meritocratic. And the challenge is that we don't know how many people we need because it depends on everything else that's going. Well, firstly, because we don't have a centrally planned economy. But also because it depends on the other choices that you make, and this came up in some of the earlier panels, right? So what might be a sensible number of care workers to have in the country really depends a lot on what your policy is towards care workers, whether the social care system is reformed in a way that allows, pay to increase and to bring British people into those jobs. And that sort of discussion replicates across all of the different industries and occupations that you're going to look at. So I think I see a lot of political demand for things like the idea of, shortage occupation lists and this type of policy, and I think that that it's very difficult to make that work. Obviously there's a role for good analysis, and I think there are lots of things where we need analysis, right? Like I think if you're thinking about fiscal impacts, I think it would be useful to really understand at what point people coming on work visas are expected to make a net fiscal contribution over the course of their lifetimes, and how does that relate to their salary threshold? And it's not going to be a single salary threshold, right? It's going to depend. If someone's younger, then they're going to make a larger net contribution. All of that kind of technical stuff, absolutely worth doing. But I don't think it's going to come up with a nice, simple answer for what to do next. I'll leave it there and leave the other topics to others on the panel.
Thanks very much. Just to absolutely endorse as a, I don't know any labour market economist who really thinks that that the labour market economist on the Migration Advisory Committee can plan a sort of sector by sector approach to setting caps for migrants as the Conservative proposed, or that somehow if you bring together skills policy from the skills councils with migration policy from the MAC, as Labour has proposed, that you will somehow magically solve the problems of both migration policy and skills policy in the UK, which are deep-seated. So absolutely endorse that. Next, we have James Hampshire from the University of Sussex, Professor of Politics at the University of Sussex. So over to you.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's a big question, but I think I'd start by framing my thoughts around the tension between politics and governing. There's a famous quote by the New York governor, former New York governor, that you campaign in poetry, but govern in prose. Now, I'd say that the...
Could use a bit more poetry in this campaign.
No, I think there is poetry. I think the poetry is very bad poetry. It's a kind of rancid doggerel. Exactly. And in some cases, it's a kind of very silent, in Labour's case, kind of avoiding saying anything at all. But I think a key challenge in the politics of immigration, immigration policy making in general, and in the UK specifically, is how to reconcile the conflicting imperatives, if you like, of politics and governing. And I think, as we move forward, there are a number of things we could say about that. So I think on the one hand, if we think about why do people come to the UK, we know that the main flows to the UK at the moment come from students and work migrants. Therefore, there is demand for labour migrants across a number of sectors, and there is certainly demand for international students from universities and other education providers. And yet the politics still pushes and encourages a rather restrictive discourse, even very explicitly in the case of reform, perhaps slightly less so in the case of Conservatives, but also in the case of Labour. So I think one thing to think about is how Labour will develop policy and how they might reconcile whatever they want to do in terms of meeting the demand of universities, the demands of employers, with a kind of political discourse that's going to work for their electoral base. And my final thought on this would be, I think things will be potentially easier for Labour as we go forwards, partly because, as we've already heard, net migration is almost certainly going to fall, so that will ease some of the political pressure, but also, as Rob Ford has written about in his contribution to the report, and also the political quarterly issue that I'd give a brief plug for, Labour's electoral base is much more comfortable with migration. So I think the combination of falling numbers with an electoral base which is less reliant on those who oppose immigration means that resolving that tension between kind of developing an argument, developing a discourse, a story, if you like, about the benefits of immigration, the need for immigration, the demand for it, with the politics, gives some cause for optimism.
Thank you very much. And I think our next speakers probably have slightly more specific things to say. So I think I'll start with Jonathan Thomas from the Social Market Foundation, who has written on how he thinks we can reconcile the political pressures that, and political and social pressures that any government faces on this with a sort of balanced approach to migration that is both friendly to public, to migrants, and to the economy. Jonathan.
Yeah, certainly have, but I think again in breaking down the system, to me, and it's a big takeaway I think from today, right? That when you're thinking about managing and control of an immigration system, you've got a big debate around the numbers of people who you are permitting to come, and then you've got this sort of separate debate around people who are coming who you have not permitted to come. And indeed, I would say people, and we haven't talked about this at all today, but this was a big feature in the last election when I was on a panel with James about people who are here and are not permitted to be here. The hostile environment was a big thing. You don't hear that anymore because everybody's focused on the border and the channel. But just coming on to the numbers and the kind of permitted part of the system first, obviously both parties have said they want to reduce those numbers. The way I framed it in a piece that I put out this week is that basically the Conservative Party wants to restrict the supply of immigrants, and the Labour Party wants to restrict the demand for immigrants. So they're looking at it from different ends of the perspective, but they want to get to the same place. And I think this raises various challenges, of course. One, which the other Jonathan could probably speak on far better than I, but maybe we can get into it, is what does that mean for growth? Something we haven't really heard much about today is what might it mean for cost of living, because a lot of immigration does have impacts on that. And then, which has already come up on this panel, how do you do this? How do you do this in a way that works? And I thought I was one of the few people who didn't have a technocratic, or think that the technocratic solution could work, but unfortunately the only other people who do think that are on this panel. So maybe the debate won't be quite as feisty as we thought. But maybe I could just for 1 minute come back to what the last panel was about, which was about the irregular flows coming in, and effectively you've got stop the boats against smash the gangs. Okay, so again, they're both very, very forceful messages, and for various reasons, both parties, I would say, have got sort of sucked into this position. They've sort of sucked each other into this position. But I do think it's a key point that Keir Starmer has repeated. This is not just something that's somewhere in their manifesto. He said it in the ITV debate. Angela Rayner finished with it in the BBC debate. This is something that they have personally committed to smashing the gangs. I think there were quite interesting points in the last panel about A, whether that's likely to work, B, whether the gangs exist at all, etc. We could go on talking about that for days. But I think this is an important point, and they've committed to something that they're going to be held accountable to from day one. If they had a different plan, they would probably have a bit more breathing space, but there's not necessarily much breathing space with this plan. A point that Sunder made, which I would like to make, which I don't think has really been made here today. In fact, the opposite has been made. I think a lot of people who are pro-migration are still talking about this bigoted demonisation. I do think the debate has moved on. There is a reason they're talking about smashing the gangs and not smashing the migrants. If you look at the debates, when I first got involved in asylum 20 years ago, and the newspaper headlines around asylum seekers bringing aids, swan bake, asylum seekers, kidnap queen swans and barbecue them, those stories would never appear now. Farage in a debate doesn't demonise migrants. He says, I think they're less productive than you think they are. The question about migration at that debate was also just about, is it pressure on services? So I do think the debate really has moved in the last 20 years in the right-wing press is nothing like what it was. You might think it's terrible. It's nothing like what it was 20 years ago. My final point on this smashing the gangs, though, is I have a concern about this use of criminality. I think if you posit it as an immigration problem, you can say 30,000 is too much, 20,000 is okay, or maybe 10, maybe 15, because look at all these other hundreds of thousands. This is just a small part. If you say that it is, kind of heinous criminal gangs, it's a systemic problem, we are being taken advantage of, it's quite hard to dial that down to an acceptable figure. And if you can't smash the gangs, how do you ever then reverse out of that position? And that's where Sarah comes in, because she's in charge of Labour policy.
This is news to me.
So Jonathan has helpfully introduced Sarah. Sarah has been working on migration. I was going to say Sarah has been working on migration policy almost as long as I have, but that would be sort of imply that she's as old as I am, which is not. But she has at IPPR and then at the Greater London Authority and as a freelancer, and most recently in a paper that she co-authored for Labour Together, the think tank. I probably Jonathan is slightly overstating, but equally it's not unreasonable to say that she's more proximate to Labour policy than anyone else on this panel. So over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, for the record, I'm definitely not in charge of any policy, much less Labour's. I suppose I just wanted to think a little bit about the reality of, what is looking likely to be a new government coming into the Home Office and actually governing and, being in charge of the immigration system. And I think if you sort of, personally, I find it terrifying to think about walking into that and being in charge of it and having to fix all these problems. But, it's going to have to be done. And I think that there will be a set of problems which, from a governing point of view, and completely agree with the kind of poetry and prose point. And I suppose I would just say that I think the prose on this issue is pretty dense and pretty difficult and, pretty boring in lots of places. So the distance between the poetry and the prose is quite big. But there will be at least a few very urgent problems which a new set of ministers will have to tackle. So we've already talked a lot about small boats, but if we think about the people who are already here, it's costing the government millions of pounds a day to accommodate and support the backlog of people who are in the asylum system. And although the current government has taken some steps to clear some of that backlog, it is continuing to build up, and there is a big backlog of appeals, which is going to cause the same cost pressures. And as already been mentioned, there will also be really kind of urgent pressures on a new set of ministers to make decisions about student migration, about worker migration, about, do we have enough care workers? There will be a lot of pressures on that Home Office team. So there will be some very urgent problems which will sort of rise naturally to the top of the inbox, if you like. But I think underneath that, there are some really deep structural problems with the inheritance that a new government will have. And just to give some examples of that, cross-government working on migration at the moment, I think, is not very effective. The Home Office is sort of often it feels like they've got the shutters down, they're off by themselves, they're trying to kind of keep everybody at bay. And so the conversations that need to happen, and I completely agree with a lot of what's been said about skills policy and migration policy, but it's clear that there needs to be a conversation about the connections between migration policy and skills policy, migration policy and fiscal policy, migration policy and social care policy. At the moment, those conversations don't happen enough, they don't happen well, and there aren't the structures in place to have them happen. And that really makes it difficult for governments to make good policy. Similarly, I think the relationship between central government and local government on these issues is really terribly broken at the moment. The experience of local government over the last decade has been pretty awful in general, and on this issue in particular, I think it's just felt like a series of kind of central government created crises which have been kind of landed on the laps of local government with not much support. There's been this sort of multiplicity of schemes and never enough money, and there's some really fundamental kind of work to be done, I think, to rebuild that partnership. And then the third thing I would say is you've got these sort of urgent problems, there are some deep structural things, and then no doubt there are problems that those of us sitting outside government don't know about, which will emerge over the first months and years of a new government from the past. So in terms of what a new government might do about that, I think the good news is that there are some quick wins to be had by, and I was saying this to Jonathan beforehand, simply by just stopping some of the very bad policy that the current government has implemented. Labour have already said that they will end the Rwanda scheme, for example. It seems pretty clear to me, at least, that the Illegal Migration Act will need to be repealed in order to do anything about the asylum backlog. And actually, there are some quite quick steps that a new government could take which would immediately relieve pressure on the system and actually which would save a lot of money. However, solving those kind of deeper structural problems in the system is going to take many years of hard work. It is not a coincidence that migration policy goes wrong for governments of all different stripes. It goes wrong for lots of different ministers. It goes wrong in lots of different ways. That is partly because it is a difficult and controversial and complicated issue. It is also because I think some of the kind of institutional structures that we have for actually delivering on this are really fundamentally broken. So my two kind of big things to say would be that we need to radically change how the Home Office works with the rest of government. So think about really changing the structures and the conversations that are happening across government and between different departments. And then we also need to open up the Home Office and build its accountability. So that is accountability to Parliament, that is accountability to stakeholders, that is, engaging in conversations. That is quite a difficult sell to a Home Secretary. Open yourself up to accountability, Home Secretary, is not a kind of obvious winning argument. I suppose the only thing I would say is that I really do think the lesson of history here is that if you don't do that, things will keep going wrong. And, bluntly, the Home Office is a graveyard for ministerial careers for that reason. So actually, in the long term, if you want to reduce the amount of political risk and increase the amount of effective policy, I think you have to think about accountability and openness in that system. And then the final thing I would say is that I think it's really important, if we do have a Labour government, that they don't get stuck in this kind of competence frame. It would be very easy to spend the whole of the first term, whole of a second term, if there was a second term, just trying to fix these problems. I think it's really important that Labour, if they do form a government, have a really distinctive and progressive offer on migration. And my personal pitch for that would be a focus on citizenship, which is always has been rather, I think, kind of under-discussed in the British debate in recent years, and where I think actually there's a huge amount of really good policy that could be implemented, but I will leave it there.
Thank you very much. Maybe ask James if you want to react to some of that, because that's very much in your area, and sort of have
Yeah, I would, just particularly what Sarah was saying there. I think that's a really good point there about the connections between policy areas and government departments. I think if you had to think about where is demand for migration coming from in the UK, and give two examples: students, the largest single visa category, and care workers, the largest work visa category. Both are shaped by, demand for both is shaped by, in the university's case, the funding model for higher education, and in the work visa case, the structures for social care and the underfunding of social care. So I think, if you don't join up those things, you're not going to be able to solve the problems. Immigration policy acts as a filter between demand and supply. But unless you're, as the Home Office, looking at what is generating demand and talking to people who make policies on higher education, etc., then you're always going to be fighting a losing battle. So I think that connection is really important. Could I just do one other quick thing? So what Jonathan was saying about smash the gangs. I just wondered whether, in your view, that could become the next stop the boats. Whether there's a risk here that Labour actually, in terms of protecting its flank, the so-called red wall in particular, it has started to make some commitments and use some language which might come back to haunt it. That was
I suppose that was the point I was making. I don't think you can find many people who think you can smash the gangs, and yet not only did he say smash the gangs, but he said, I used to be Director of Public Prosecution, so I refuse to believe that you can't smash the gangs. And I think a number of points have been made around that already, but one of the things I would say, you can smash the gangs, right? The guy in El Salvador did it, the guy in the Philippines did it. Those gangs were gangs, and they were in his country, and they were discernible things. All of these things, do they exist, do they not exist? If they do exist, they exist transnationally. It just seems like a massive... I understand why they're doing it. They had to do something. They did have other options. I understand why they did this. But I think if I was in charge of recommending, what he should do, I would have recommended that somebody else recommend that to him.
One thing which strikes me is how does all this change? If as I think we are now reasonably confident, migration does fall to migration numbers do fall quite sharply, particularly both for students and for certainly for health and social care. We don't know, as we saw in the first session, how far it will fall, how fast, but we can be reasonably certain it's going to fall by quite a lot. How does that change the sort of political and policy environment?
I think from a policy perspective, it potentially changes quite a lot because, I think that there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment about what's happening in the care sector. We've had, as you showed earlier, this massive decrease in the number of care workers. My suspicion is that that's primarily related to, not to a decrease in employers' demand for care workers, but to the Home Office scrutinising the applications for certificates of sponsorship more closely, which may mean that the numbers actually continue to be much lower than they were in the past, that effectively we've got more scrutiny, and so we're not going back to the world of 100,000 care workers a year. If that's not the case, if the numbers do hop up again, then I think that debate about care will come back both from a policy perspective and politically. If we get back to a situation where care is really driving the numbers in a way that it was in 2023, then I think that conversation about the funding of the care model becomes unavoidable. But it might be for the moment that if the numbers continue to be much lower, the problem that I think that the immigration was always more visible than the shortages that the immigration was helping to address, and so I think politically probably that issue is removed a little bit. On students, I think the key thing is just how big the decline in students is, and I think at this stage we really don't know. I think there are a huge range of scenarios from actually a really massive decline that then starts to put some universities in financial trouble to something sort of reasonably modest that doesn't feel particularly noticeable.
I think what I would say as well is that if the numbers do decline, as seems likely, hopefully that provides a new government with a bit of time and space to have some of these conversations about how they do want to shape policy. We know from experience of recent years and decades that is very difficult to do in a context where numbers are climbing and the political debate is, as a consequence, sort of becoming more and more pressured. So my hope would be that if numbers do decline a bit, that gives a new government some time and some space to fix some of the structural problems, to fix some of the systems, and to have a more I suppose, kind of nuanced conversation involving more people, including, universities, employers, other bits of government, about how they want to reset policy for the longer term. That will be much easier, I think, in a context where the numbers are declining.
Yes, I mean, it's obviously not unhelpful. I still think, the channel and irregular migration. When you speak to quite a lot of ordinary people, they're amazingly unaware of what the numbers. I know we love them and we focus on them and we say it's terrible, but people focus on them and then we're waiting for them to come out and when we focus on them. But I do think that for a number of reasons, this government is a very, 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 very strange government. Right? I would argue that they've done lots of very good things on immigration. I think the EU settlement scheme was good. I think Ukraine was good. I think Hong Kong was good. I think the post-Brexit immigration system, pretty good. Overall, really good. They could have fought this election saying, look what we've done, look how good we are. Instead, they've decided to fight the election on something they haven't done yet, which isn't very good, Rwanda. So, it is bizarre. So they've made a massive thing about their own policies causing massive numbers that they're uncomfortable with for various political reasons, and that's very strange. Very strange. So, I mean, in their manifesto today, they're calling out something that they've sort of arranged as being terrible. That is quite odd. And I do think that, for Labour, to me, it's just not as important. The Conservative government, we were talking earlier about the tens of thousands target. Various Conservative governments have made immigration important. It's become more important partly because the governing party has decided to make it important. I don't think that it's a key thing. I think the aim, I don't know, maybe Sarah will tell you, the aim if I was Labour would be to make sure nobody knows the name of the immigration minister, and to deal with energy and climate and housing and all these things that you should be wanting to do. You can't completely control that. The Daily Mail is still going to write about terrible things that are happening or that they think are terrible that are happening. But you can de-emphasize it. You can't change the play, but you can put something stage left rather than in a massive spotlight in the middle where I'm currently sitting.
I have to say that sounds like absolutely excellent advice. It's very difficult to say to a new minister, say, actually, what you should do is not very much, if possible. And
you absolutely shouldn't rebel against your government over immigration policy when you're the immigration minister. It's a very, very low bar. Let's go for that, start off with.
Anything to add?
I think avoiding focus on the numbers as much as possible. We don't want government by quarterly net migration statistics, which we've had, where the statistics come out and policies changed completely and radically, as has happened in the last instance. But I think, and I'd agree here with what Jonathan was saying, is that numbers are part of it, and they can become a big issue if you draw attention to it with the target or what have you. But it's not just about numbers, but it's about stories, it's about images, and relatively small numbers of people in the scheme of things can become the big story, as the boats show.
I would say one thing that around the numbers is that one of the reasons that the channel is an issue is that there are weekly numbers released
Daily.
which are, yeah, exactly, daily numbers. There are not those numbers released on people coming in small planes or big lorries or overstaying, right? So there's one way of getting into this country which has this amazing data, and I would say accountability, which in lots of ways is extremely unhelpful. I'm not sure whether you can, this sounds a bit odd for a researcher to say this, switch off some data, or say, look, it's just not helpful to have it weekly. Maybe even move it to a, quarterly. Because that is part of the problem. Yeah, it's reported because the numbers are there.
Can I ask, we've got quite a few questions online about universities and higher education more generally, and of course there are a lot of people in the room with a vested interest in this one way or the other. I mean, how should, from a policy point of view, a new government think about this whole mess, right, of a university's funding crisis has been driven by, on the one hand, the political imperative to hold down fees for domestic students, leading first to a huge expansion in the number of overseas students paying more and hence subsidizing everything else the university do, and then that running into a political sort of headwind, which has left us with, as Madeleine says, we don't know whether this is a manageable decline or a running off a cliff scenario, or probably somewhere in between, I guess, but that means, at least for some universities, it's going to be very bad, and certainly for the new education minister, it's going to be a big headache. How should government think about making policy in this? Anyone want to? This is a very difficult question to which I do not know the answer, which is why I'm asking it.
I mean, it's about the underlying problems, right? And I think the challenge, I see why we've ended up in a situation where where effectively immigration is papering over the problems created elsewhere in the system, because the immigration option is often free, whereas fixing the underlying problem can be very expensive. And I think that's the sort of political dynamic that's led to a situation where those problems have not been fixed, because it's more controversial, can be more controversial, to say, for example, students are going to pay a lot more for their undergraduate education than to, allow immigration to creep up a little bit.
Yeah, I think the existential risk to the sector, so I'm going to stick up for the people who are a bit more, maybe things are a bit too toppy in international students, which is a bit different place from where the other journalist is. But I think the fact that it's become such an existential position from the sector means that the sector feels it can give no ground. So it takes massively aggressive positions against any suggestion that there should be any, review or that we should restrict in any way. And we've come out with at the moment anyway, restricting dependents, but not the post-study work routes, which I think maybe people sitting towards the middle of the debate, which is where I put myself, think isn't a bad place. So we might have a sort of broken system and a strange way of getting to the answer. But along with a few of the other things I mentioned earlier, I'm not always sure we get to the worst answers. Rwanda was a bad answer, but most of the other answers we come to, I think, and I think I wouldn't disagree with Sarah about the accountability, but I'm quite surprised in this country when I look at some other countries, how much accountability there is. You might say there should be a lot more, but we have a chief inspector of borders. You might say, well, he was sacked, but he can still go in every newspaper in the land and say whatever he wants to, go on whatever television program he wants to. We have a migration advisory committee who say, God, the government's doing a terrible job on social care. We have, if you just dial into any Home Affairs Committee, Public Affairs Committee, they have a Home Secretary and the Permanent Secretary sitting in front of them. They can ask them anything. So I do think we do, maybe a bit of a better job than we give ourselves credit for. And I don't normally say that, but just because everybody today has said the opposite, I thought I would get that in.
To be honest, actually, I agree with most of that. I'm not sure we are necessarily going to be in the right place at the university. We don't really know yet. But the sort of view that the system had become unbalanced and that we were over-reliant on that while international students are a very good thing overall, that we'd become over-reliant on them to cross-subsidize, and that was ultimately unstable. I think that analysis seems to be absolutely right, actually.
I think just on the accountability point, I think, sorry, I think this goes to the point that Madeleine was making about why these choices are made. I think part of the problem is that not only is it sometimes cheaper or free to sort of go down the immigration option, just in very sort of procedural terms, it's very, very simple. The Home Secretary can basically just change the immigration rules. And this is kind of what I'm getting to with the accountability. It's too easy for ministers to just constantly change the rules and fiddle with the system. And I think actually putting a little bit of grit in that would help, because I think it would mean that we had to have some of those conversations about the trade-offs, whereas I think at the moment, faced with a difficult set of trade-offs, one path often feels, as Madeleine said, much easier than the other, and that can be risky.
Yeah, I think I agree that it's not healthy that the higher education sector has become so dependent on international students. And clearly the funding model needs to be looked at, and my understanding is that Labour have hinted that that might be something they're going to consider. On the other hand, I do think the way in which international students has been problematised is a problem, if I can say that, and we should, and the next government would be wise to be making more of a case for the various benefits, financial, cultural, economic, social, political, of international student migration. And personally, I also would like to see them reintroduce the ability of students, certainly at least postgraduate taught students, to bring dependents. I mean, you can do that, I believe, if you go to the US, and the UK is competing with other English language countries, and we're going to lose out on international students if we don't do that. But I say that as someone who's got a very clearly vested interest, and moreover, someone whose partner is at Goldsmiths, which is currently sacking about a quarter of its academic faculty, partly because of the funding crisis in higher education. So yeah, I think the dependence on students is a problem, but the way in which students, you could, for example, I think you could, and in my view should, take students out of the net migration statistics, or at least you could present the statistics, you could have the net migration figure, but you could make a kind of clearer distinction between the number with and the number with students taken out.
They're doing that now.
Are they?
Yeah, the Office of National Statistics have developed. I'm not a fan of taking them out entirely. I think they're still people, and we count people, and so it's good to have them in. But there are now alternative views that you can look at, that if you want to remove students or other groups, that you can.
Yes, we're getting. I mean, the data is not what we'd all like, but it is getting considerably better than it was, and you can look at this in somewhat more granularity than you used to. Let me take some questions from the room, if there's anyone. I've got Sundar and then Zoe.
Question is just to slightly challenge the idea that kind of avoiding the subject if possible and hoping people don't notice and it goes away is going to be the effective way to manage immigration. To ask about another approach you could take, because for example, we had very high increases of net migration. When the figures came out, we had very restrictive policies the next week on dependents and so on, but we don't have a process of immigration like we have with a budget a couple of times a year and so on. So would it be better to lean in to having more of a process about trade-offs when decisions will be made and so on? And if there might be a breathing space if net migration halves, if the next government doesn't want to be judged on is the level of net migration lower every quarter or every 6 months, what could it say it wants to be judged on?
That's a good question, which obviously relates to your long-standing proposal of a migration budget. I think, like Jill, I don't know if Jill's still here, I'm slightly sceptical that the UK budget process, where the Chancellor stands up and delivers all sorts of mad, cooked-up policies that somehow miraculously meet the OBR's targets, and then are nodded through by the House of Commons in a debate no one listens to, is a model. But that said, your general point about should there be a more structured and open process, I think does resonate with some of the people. So anyone want to sort of...
Could I just suggest a different way of framing this rather than it being about sort of keeping quiet on it? I think there's something about just normalising migration policy, as part of public policy. There's lots of complicated and difficult decisions that government have to make in all kinds of areas, and I think if we could get to a point where migration felt like a normal part of the public discourse. So, you know, we can talk about it in public, but it can be discussed in the same way that lots of other complicated and difficult areas of public policy are. That would be great progress. I mean, I do like the idea of a migration budget. I feel obliged at this point to qualify this with it's sort of budget with a capital B, not budget with a small b, because I think there's various proposals around migration caps which are being described as budgets. But I think not necessarily exactly taking the budget process, but just thinking about a structured and regular process for making decisions about this in stark contrast to what currently happens, whereas various people have said, you know, a set of figures lands, the government panics, they rush out a whole bunch of policy proposals and then have to undo a load of them and change them. You know, just having a regular, normal cycle of policy development and implementation would be a great step forward from where we are. And then it would make it much easier to talk about in a way which didn't seem so dangerous, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anybody has said we should be quiet. I mean, I don't think smashing the gangs is being quiet. And you might say, well, that's not an immigration policy. You know, absolutely is, as far as the public are concerned. That's the number one. That's the only immigration policy in their pledges. So I don't think we're saying that. And I have written in here about trade-offs, so I'm sort of got to agree with you. But I am also a bit more sceptical of this migration budget. I think it's often used when, you know, Neil O'Brien gets in a room with Robert Jenrick and they say, let's put a report saying we should have a migration day where me and you can agree these are the trade-offs and this is how it looks. And then there's Sunder Katwala and Jonathan Portes on Twitter saying, hey, let's have this migration day and maybe we can get in a room and sign. So you're just going to have all the same debates. You may need fighting. It's definitely, though, not, I think, and I think what we've all agreed today, not really susceptible to some really brainy person saying, look, I can break up the fight because here is the objective answer. I don't think it's going to get you that much closer, or maybe not as close as you think, to a calmer, objective policy, but I might be wrong. I think it's worth trying. Lots of other things haven't worked.
Just on the point about, I think it's a good question, right? If we shouldn't be judging only on the numbers, what should we be judging on? In theory, the answer is probably like the impacts, right? But unfortunately, there's an incredibly complicated, you know, there are many different kinds of impacts. There are some obviously impacts that are measurable, and I think the challenge there is we just often don't have the data to do it, right? So you have these new immigration, you know, global talent sounds like a great idea. Everyone likes global talent. Do we know anything about, you know, what these people are doing? How, you know, are they flourishing here? Who knows, right? We have no idea. So I think there probably like some modest steps could be taken to improve the data. And there is some work actually already happening, but I think it needs to be a lot faster if we are to have any hope of understanding actually what these immigration policies are actually doing on the measurable stuff, which is basically the economy.
Zoe?
Yeah, thank you. So I want to make clear that I really appreciate the sort of level of debate that this whole day really, and definitely this panel has sort of held it at, is, you know, it's about the macroeconomic needs of the country. It's about, you know, like taking a sensible and forward-looking and data-driven approach. And I really do appreciate that conversation. I think it's necessary. But when talking about the challenges for the next government, we've only heard one quote that I can remember from a member of the public who falls on the anti-migration side of this today, and it was that there's too many mosques. And I think that a conversation about migration that doesn't actually dig in a little more into this growing concern about cultural impacts, aka racism, Islamophobia, anxiety about Islam, and how that is being deliberately and very, very obviously stirred, poked and provoked by certain members of, you know, the commentariat, politicians who are probably going to gain profile over the next 5 years, and Labour's coalition, if Labour's the government, you know, and how that all plays out. I don't think there's any sort of technocratic, you know, how do we disaggregate the numbers, how do we talk about the numbers in a better way, or take it away from the numbers and start talking about the needs of universities and all that. That's all necessary, but it's also necessary to address Islamophobia, and it's also necessary to address how that emotional reaction comes out, regardless of the numbers needed to fund university places or whatever. So I would really appreciate if you could all respond to that. And I know I didn't formulate an exact question, and I apologize because that's really annoying.
sure if everyone here can or is able to respond to that given their positions, but James certainly
Well, I'll
can.
give it a go. I mean, I completely agree, and I think it dovetails nicely with the question from Sundar. So I think, one thing we haven't talked about much today actually is Nigel Farage. I mean, there's a possibility he's going to be elected. There's a possibility he might take over the Conservative Party. I think there's a likelihood that a major line of attack from the right over the next Parliament to what will certainly be a Labour government with a large majority will be on immigration, and I think those attack lines will land in certain audiences. So I agree that a Labour government needs a way of talking about migration, which isn't just about economic demand. It has to be about identity, as British Future talks about. It has to be about pushing back against racism, pushing back against Islamophobia. And there are kind of precedents. I mean, wasn't personally a huge fan of the Blair governments, but I was doing some research on the discourse of New Labour around immigration a few years ago, and reading some of Tony Blair's speeches in the early 2000s, and it was like entering a different world. I mean, Tony Blair, the way he talked about migration, he celebrated Britain as being a cosmopolitan hub, I think was a phrase that was used. So there was a lot of language coming out of Labour at that time, which went well beyond saying immigration is economically desirable. And a lot of the language now, I think, is too narrow, and narrowly economistic, but also narrow in terms of identifying small numbers of people. So the particular phrase that bugs me is best and brightest. Everybody wants the bloody best and brightest, right? That is not what most migrants are. But those other migrants who are not the best and brightest, they're not the investors on the investor visas, they're not the highly skilled migrants. They're bringing all sorts of benefits. So I think a broader language there. And a language that talks about identity. I mean, I think Labour is going to have to engage on that, because I think that's going to be something that will come from Farage or the Conservative Party as it pushes to the right.
Either of you two want to?
I think that's right. I suppose the only thing I would add is I think that there are policy levers here that can also have an impact on some of these non-economic debates. And broadly speaking, government has massively retreated from questions about what happens to people after they arrive in the UK and when they settle. And it's why I mentioned citizenship in my remarks at the beginning. I do think that citizenship in its broadest sense, thinking about people's routes to settle in the UK, the ways they become connected with communities, the ways that they, that their identities change with migration, and that is again a sort of a normal and natural part of that process. I do think there are steps that government can make to smooth those journeys, and it won't solve all the problems that you've described, but I think at the margins it can have a difference, and it can help provide a bit of an anchor for exactly the sorts of conversations that we've just been hearing about.
Nothing to add from my side.
I want to follow up on that. I mean, it does worry me that the Labour Party's branding at the moment has become very nationalistic. The Labour Party campaign posters that I see, there aren't many where I live, are Union Jack. Now, we can have a debate about how that's interpreted and how that relates to patriotism and so on. But I think the Labour Party has gone too far in trying to address, this is my personal opinion now, address some of the concerns from immigration skeptics or anti-immigrant voters. And that's going to be a difficulty when it's going to come under attack when it's in government. It hasn't sort of laid the groundwork in the way that I think, the economic conditions of the parlour state of the country perhaps partly explains that, but I think it's kind of been reaching a little bit too much for a kind of nationalistic discourse, which is going to make it hard to push back if that line of attack comes in the future. Sorry.
Thanks. Just behind Cinder.
Hi, quick question for Jonathan. You had a report about the immigration skills charge. I just wanted to ask, is that money still available? Is it money that Labour can use if they potentially get into government, or has the money disappeared down the drain?
Good question. You've been reading things I wrote. Wow. Okay, see me afterwards for a drink. So, almost certainly no. What we've written about that is, and Madeleine would say, well, it doesn't really matter because it's not very big. So it doesn't matter if it's fallen down the back of a sofa somewhere. But the point, and I think this is a point more generally around, and I defer to the skills people that this way of managing demand by saying we're going to invest more in local people, might not work for a decade. I remember people abusing Nick Clegg to say, why didn't he do this a decade ago? Well, then he said it won't work for a decade, so he didn't do it. So, people are always putting off this stuff. I think you've got to try it. But there is, more so than any other policy area, I think, a huge performative element to immigration which says, look, we're trying. You say that we're not employing local people. We're trying to invest in local stuff. We're trying, and this is my whole point of what I wrote about the immigration skills charge. If employers are paying a charge, which they're being charged for hiring immigrant labor, and that charge is meant to be able to be used, is meant to be used for local skills and training, then it should be used for local skills and training. If it's only 2 billion and it will only last 3 days, well, it doesn't matter so much. It's the fact that you are at least publicising that there is at least some joined up thinking and some, cross benefits. It's not all going, and this is, what I've said to employers as well, is if employers are getting a kicking for just using immigrant labour, why don't they say, hey, we've paid 2 billion for local skills training. If you're going to pay it, get some credit for it. Now, like all of these other things, it just goes into a black hole, and it's probably being used to fund Bobbies on the Beat or something else. Nobody knows. That's the whole point. Nobody knows. But I think it would be better if you could put these things up and say, hey, look, we're trying. Here's what we're doing here. Here's what we're doing there. Yes, I completely accept the experts who say that's not going to change immigration for some while, but you have to start somewhere, I think, as Sarah says. Otherwise, you'd never do anything, right? You'd just be in a trough of despair.
Here, third row back. Yeah. Okay, more and more questions now.
I don't know what the panel think on this, but looking towards the next Labour government that seems to be inevitable, bearing in mind Labour has a high premium on housing, because there's not enough houses being built by the current government, and bearing in mind, as mentioned earlier today, the link between immigration, excess immigration, shall we say, and housing pressures, as long as there's housing shortage, in my view, Labour's going to be in trouble over immigration. They want to reduce the pressure on the issue of immigration being a problem. They're going to have to make massive housing to house everybody who's here, including the immigrants who come in already. If there's no housing problem, no one's going to get upset about immigration. That, I think, is what they should be aiming at. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Anyone want to pick up on that quickly? Because there's several more people. And
I would say that housing is big. We didn't mention it. I mean, in international students, it is the main thing. When you talk to people or when you go into the locales, it's the main problem. Can we accommodate all of these people? And it's been, as has come up a number of times today, the problems in other countries. Canada and Australia have capped their numbers around this housing. And there is this timing issue that, as Jonathan's greatest foe, Neil O'Brien, would say, you can't build a house overnight. So even if you know what's coming, you can't deal with it. But this is an area where hopefully the reduction of the numbers will ease things. But absolutely, I think most people would say when you get into the weeds of a lot of these issues, housing is a key issue in some of these debates. And frankly, if we had a debate in this country around international students and housing, it would be a lot more sensible than having a sort of immigration debate about it.
Thanks. I think that that sounds very sensible to me. But Sarah at the back, and then second row, and then I think we'll have to call a halt.
Hi. Thank you. It's been really helpful to kind of hear a little bit about the various opportunities that may emerge for changing some of this. But one thing I would really welcome some more comment or reflection on, and I think Sarah has mentioned the relationship between central and local government, but also between the relationship between government and the devolved administrations, how that will change, both in terms of opportunities for better engagement, which has been sorely lacking, but also new opportunities for learning. And I was thinking some of the conversation between Zoe and James's comments. I mean, there are things that have happened in Scotland around like the emergence of a rhetoric around New Scots in relation to refugee integration, where there are breeding grounds both in Scotland and Wales, in my view, where governments have been trying to tackle some of these things differently. They have had the benefit of a slightly different electoral calculus, giving them the space to do that. But I wonder whether there's things that one might either learn or adopt, or I don't know. I would welcome comments on that and how that might change, and whether there is scope for some of that to be more positive?
I mean, I completely agree, and I think that there's loads of really interesting practice happening around the country in different places and in different communities, and there's definitely more that can be done, I think, to learn from that and spread some of those ideas around. I also think that a lot of and it comes back to the point about the kind of the non-economic impacts of migration, a lot of these issues can only be tackled at the local level, actually. You know, you've got to have different conversations in different places, and you've got to empower local government, devolved governments, you know, regional governments to be able to engage in a meaningful way. I think the problem at the moment is that often local government feel like they don't have any power to actually do anything about this, but then they're left to sort of manage the consequences and to have the conversations, which are often quite difficult conversations at a local level. So I think that absolutely there's a conversation to be had here. I think that in terms of knowing where to start with that, I think looking at those places where things are working and where there are examples of good practice, it sort of helps with the council of despair as well. You know, there are really interesting things happening around the country, and actually I think there are real opportunities for a new government to look at those and build on them.
I don't know enough about Scotland. I mean, you could answer your own question better than I would be able to. But I do think there's something here about the UK as a multinational country that's sort of been lost a little bit recently. That I think, given the centre of gravity in terms of votes for the government that's been in power for 14 years, the sort of, you know, Scotland, Wales, what's going on there could be brought much more into the conversation. And again, I was thinking back to, you know, the early 2000s, which was clearly a very different economic situation. The Labour government came in, you know, with a growing economy. But again, there was a sort of discourse there around celebrating the multinational, multicultural nature of Britain, which I don't see in the current Labour Party. Now, I know I'm not directly answering your question, and I simply don't know about what's going on the ground in the devolved regions, but you know, devolved nations, sorry. But you know, I think there are opportunities there for sure.
And one final question, I think, here.
Hi, yeah, something that's just been going through my head all day pretty much is about population growth and the fact that the latest population projections show annual net migration settling at around 300,000 people per year, without which the change from natural change effectively would see the population shrinking. And we've got a situation where whichever government comes into power, they've both committed to lowering net migration, potentially to below that level. Just wanted to ask what effect you think it might have on the economy if that's achieved, or do you think it's just something that no one needs to worry about because it's not realistic that it would go significantly below that level?
Who would like to pick up on that?
You might want to start because that's your expert topic.
Well, I mean, as I say, I think I did mention this in the first session, which is that, you know, first of all, these projections, of course, are as we've seen over the last 3 years. Nobody projected, I certainly didn't, and nobody did, you know, I know this, what's happened to migration over the last 5 years. All we know about the projections is that I've done both macroeconomic forecasting and migration forecasting, and macroeconomic forecasting is like throwing darts blindfold. Migration forecasting is much worse. But we do know quite a lot about the demographics. And so, as I think I said before, what worries me is that you have a economic, political, and demographic doom loop whereby, you know, the migration leads to economic pressures for labor, for labor influxes. At the same time, that in turn leads to irregular migration, which poisons the political atmosphere, which leads to restrictions on migration. Legal migration, so you get more irregular migration. At the same time, the population gets older and less willing, you know, more and more conservative socially, and votes against more migration. So you basically end up like Italy, in a completely dysfunctional position where actually you have rather powerful political interests who, you know, in government, who at the same time get votes by being tough on immigration, at the same time as actually relying on illegal migration to work in their factories, and because the people who fund the current right-wing government in Italy are also people who employ the illegal migrants who they claim they win elections by railing against it, and that is not where you want to be. So we need to avoid that particular doom loop, but how you avoid it, I think, is actually quite difficult. You need to have a sort of a policy, and I think this is something we're all in agreement, where you manage both the politics and the economics in a sort of smooth and stable way. Not, and I agree with Sandra here, not by sort of brushing these things under the carpet, but by recognizing the trade-offs and having some degree of stability, both in policy and in politics and how you talk about these things.
Yeah, I mean, in demographics, I would say that just looking at the massive macro level, the UK is uniquely exposed to the two countries in the world that are still creating people, Nigeria and India. So we're faced to a massive sort of supply. What are we going to do with that? Well, we'll see. In terms of like the real micro, I suppose, yeah, does restricting affect growth, or maybe to flip it round, can you still grow while keeping your numbers lower? There are ways that you can rely more on routes where people come and go, and therefore your numbers are not higher. So, for instance, we've hardly talked about business at all today. They're going to have a sea change whatever happens here. Either Labour are going to be meddling in their training, or the Tories are going to be meddling by capping them. But they're always saying they don't really want migration; they just need mobility. And it's been very hard for them to even bring people in for short terms. So you can look at things, much more sort of mobility, youth mobility scheme, graduate scheme. If people come and go, you can still get lots of value from them, and they don't necessarily put the net numbers up. The highly skilled routes have really withered under the Tories, which is a bit ironic given they're best and brightest. So again, you could focus on that. But then I suppose the one caveat to that is it's easy to think that you're cutting people and it's not impacting growth because you don't know what they're doing. And the key thing about that at the moment, I think, is we're cutting dependents. And because there's no record about the economic contribution of those dependents, we're saying, well, that's free. We're just cutting them and we're not losing any growth. But as Jonathan has pointed out, they're doing a hell of a lot. I mean, in fact, a recent Home Office survey, again, suggested most of them indeed are working. So you can sort of kid yourself that you're not impacting growth just because you're not collecting data on what the people you're cutting are doing.
It's 5:04, so I'm going to bring that to that. Yeah, but if any of you want to say 2 sentences before we close on summing up what you think the priority should be or what we should do.
Can I use I'll just use my 2 sentences.
Yeah.
I think it was Haynes who said demography is destiny.
Yeah.
One of the few laws of migration is that young countries tend to be countries of emigration, and aging countries tend to be countries of immigration. The UK and most of Europe is aging. Africa, large parts of Asia are young. I'll leave it there.
Sarah?
I suppose maybe just to go back to the point which Cinder, I think, raised in his question, which is that a new government needs to, this is going to sound like the most modest proposal ever, but set some objectives for migration policy and be clear about what it is you're trying to achieve. In any other area of policy, that would be like the most basic thing you could ever say. It hasn't been done in the UK on migration policy for a long time.
Yeah, I think, so okay, I missed the panel after lunch, so I might be wrong about this, but I think one interesting thing is that the area of policy where the UK is arguably most unusual by international standards has not been discussed today, which is family unification. So that the UK is uniquely restrictive in that area, and I think the fact that it hasn't really come into the discussion at all sort of illustrates something about the politics of that area, which is that it's so low profile and sort of flies under the radar that it gets lost in all the discussion about the much bigger routes that the UK has.
Yeah, Yeah, I mean, I'm a very glass half full person, and I feel I've been way too glass half empty during this panel. So I'm going to say, yeah, there are loads of challenges, but there are also opportunities. And as I said, despite the fact that nobody wants to claim any credit for them, there are things that are working okay. To use a Portisism, I think you said, not broke, don't fix, on a large amount of the labour immigration system. That doesn't mean we shouldn't, improve it, but I think we shouldn't lose sight. And I think because inevitably there's going to be so much to do, Labour are going to have to pick what they want to do. But, lots of things are working well enough to be able to leverage them to work even better without needing to rip them up. Because the one thing public do not like, if they're trying to find trust in politicians, is people changing the whole system every year or so, because they realise that even the politicians have no faith in the system, so why would they?
Well, on that rare but very welcome optimistic note, which I thoroughly endorse, thank you to all the panelists. Thank you all to the audience. I noticed that as on the last migration conference we had here, and in contrast to some other conferences we have, or indeed that I've been to, most people have stayed for the full day, which I think is a resounding vote of confidence in all the panelists. Thank you to the organisers, to the UK and Changing Europe team, who've all seen standing around at the back and made everything run so smoothly. And I suppose I have to say thanks to Anand as well, because, whatever, he's sitting there in the background staring at me. As I said before, I'm very pleased to say that thanks to Political Quarterly and James, you're all most welcome to join us for a drink.
Thank you.